Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining our presentation on the Ways to Equity Playbook at the 2020 Inclusion Collaborative Conference. The Ways to Equity Playbook that we'll be presenting today is a guide to engaging equity work at the school, district, or county office levels. In today's presentation, we're going to provide an overview of the playbook with information about the design and the content, tools and resources offered through the guide, and then we will focus for most of the hour on the sections on our focal student groups: African American students, students with disabilities, and English learners. We're so pleased to have you today. So before we get into the overview, let's present the people who will be speaking to you today. So I'm Erica Boas. I'm a researcher and improvement specialist, and I was the project lead of the Ways to Equity Playbook and the lead author as well. Thank you, Dr. Birts and Dr. Villalobos. So here is our roadmap for today. We will be spending a few minutes acclimating you to what's in the playbook, the structure of the playbook, and how to use it to an extent. We will be offering a presentation later on how to use the playbook, not within this conference, but on the Inclusion Collaborative website. We will, like I said, be focused on presenting our student groups, and along with our student groups, we will be providing you with a sampling of some of the equity tools and resources that are aligned with, to some extent, those student groups. In the end, we will talk about the next steps to being able to use the Ways to Equity Playbook, which we hope you all do, and giving you some contact information. Then we'll open up the platform to your questions, and hopefully you have many of them, so jot them down as you are listening to our presentation. So without further ado, I'll get into the overview. The Ways to Equity Playbook is the outcome of a state equity grant that's part of the California system of support. The Santa Clara County Office of Education is one of 2 state equity leads in California. And we were, as an equity lead, we were responsible for several activities, including the development of new resources and activities to promote student equity, dissemination of information on effective equity practices, equity trainings, and partnering with LEAs, or local education agencies, and schools to drive equity for their focal student groups. That is, once again, African American students, students with disabilities, and English learners. So funding for the equity work was made available via the California Equity Performance and Improvement Program, or CPIP grant. And this was, the Ways to Equity Playbook is one product of this grant. The 2-year, $2.5 million grant was authorized by Assembly Bill 99 and awarded to SCCOE's Inclusion Collaborative and the San Diego County Office of Education for capacity building purposes. So here we present one product of this grant today. So what is the Ways to Equity Playbook? In sum, the Ways to Equity Playbook is a versatile navigation tool to guide practices towards student equity with accessible, differentiated on-ramps so users can honor their own starting places, that is packed with tools and resources for engaging equity work. So that's in a nutshell. The goal of today's presentation is to provide you with some details on what the playbook offers to you as a user. So just a bit more to give you a big picture sense of what the Ways to Equity Playbook is. So it's grounded in 5 overarching approaches to undertaking equity work. First, it takes a systems change approach to understanding and taking action to advance equity in classrooms, schools, districts, and communities. Methods are based in continuous improvement strategies and a multi-tiered system of support, or MTSS framework. So it builds on the methods that are already being used by schools and districts across the state. It takes a strong stance that inequities are systemic problems, and therefore equity is about changing the systems in which we operate. Second, it's versatile and adaptable to various contexts. So this is not a checklist or a standardized one-size-fits-all compliance strategy for addressing equity. It's a process that's worthy of the time commitment necessary to carry out your vision for equity. We, the authors, hope that the playbook will be widely engaged by diverse users. Third, it prioritizes collaboration and shared leadership across stakeholder groups by flattening traditional hierarchical leadership arrangements. So we have to be willing to look at the ways in which we have coordinated and structured and understood what leadership means. Fourth, it humanizes data by rooting in the practice of honestly listening to, raising up, and grounding student and community experiences in the work to advance equity. It promotes the idea that all statistical data are made of multidimensional human experiences. And this cannot be forgotten as we look at charts, tables, and vast arrays of numbers. Fifth and finally, it centers targeted universalism with a focus on the three aforementioned student groups. Universal goals can be met for all students by focusing on how to achieve equity for these specific student groups within a particular context. Using universal design for learning puts this concept into concrete practice. So next is our table of contents, and I want to mention that if you access the attachments in our presentation portal, we've provided you a copy of the table of contents. It's useful as kind of an outline for what we are offering with this 80-page playbook. So the table of contents provides an outline of our content. What we've highlighted here are some of the sections that we think are important for understanding how this playbook has been put together. So first, we provide guidance on how to use the playbook. The on-ramps I'll be going into on the next slides are how to kind of begin, continue on your equity journey. The center part is really centered on our focal student groups, African American students, English learners, and students with disabilities. One of the key aspects of this, given that we take a targeted universalist approach, is the universal design for learning section. And we also provide guidance on equity by state dashboard indicators. So we look at, for example, suspension, chronic absenteeism, academic outcomes, etc. So please go ahead and access that as one of our attachments in our portal. And these are our on-ramps, and I want to take a moment to spotlight the on-ramps. And this is how to begin and continue on your equity journey. So we understand that schools, districts, and county offices start at different places on their equity journey, but we also know that we could use some guidance on how to go about meeting different benchmarks or areas for being able to really undertake equity work. So as the title suggests, this rubric is to help you assess and identify where you are in your equity work, early, middle, or further along. From here, you can use these on-ramps as a tool to construct your own trajectory around your equity journey. So the on-ramps explore 7 main topics, which are bolded. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but on the left-hand side here. And they include leadership development, teacher and staff development, data and research, planning, communication, culture and climate, and finally, progress monitoring. Each of the middle columns represents a starting place. But the idea is that in order to engage equity processes and practices as fully as possible, you will want to complete each of the columns kind of row by row. So even if you find that mostly you're in the middle column, you'll want to look back and see that you've met some of the these areas in the preceding column. And finally, the blue column on this side, which for me is my right-hand side, link to related sections within the playbook. So we try to make this as easy to use as possible. And before we move into our focal groups, I want to provide you with the definition of equity that we use in the playbook. So we take up the definition developed by the National Equity Project, who facilitated for us in our process a liberatory design approach to developing this playbook. And we define equity as each student receives what they need when they need it to thrive academically and social emotionally. Pedro Noguera in 2019 explained that the true meaning of equity is, quote, acknowledging students' differences and giving them what they need to be successful. It also means staying focused on outcomes, both academic and developmental. So the image on my left-hand side right here is created and used by the Inclusion Collaborative, and it illustrates the idea that each student may need something different to reach their potential, and each resource provided interrupts inequitable practices so that this can happen. So with this, we can move into discussion of the focal student groups, beginning with Dr. Angela Birts and African American students.
Good morning, everyone. To begin this section, I offer historical background about the education of African Americans in this country, as noted in the images to the right. The prohibition of education for African Americans has deep roots in American history. For instance, before the Civil War, the teaching of African Americans, enslaved or free, to read or write in the United States was a criminal endeavor. Emerging in the 1870s, Jim Crow laws ruled the educational system in schools became legally, racially segregated, and that white and colored persons shall not be taught in the same school. By 1896, the U.S. Supreme Court endorsed the doctrine of separate but equal in Plessy versus Ferguson, which was later overturned in the historical landmark case Brown versus the Board of Education. In Brown versus the Board of Education of 1954, the Supreme Court ruled that racial segregation of children in public schools was unconstitutional, beginning the fight to integrate schools. As history shows, African Americans want fair, quality, and equitable educational opportunities for themselves and their children. No matter their circumstance and conditions, there is an inherent desire for African Americans to want more for themselves, to thrive, and to achieve. Yet, racism, systemic oppression, and discrimination flood many communities, classrooms, and school halls, effectively curtailing the road to success for many students. Though many unfairly bear the brunt of these social conditions that are beyond their control, so many push ahead, achieve, and flourish despite the adversity. The social, cultural, and political future of our country will be defined by the opportunities we not only set for African American students, but for students of color as a whole. Next slide. The African American student population in California is on a steady decline. African American students, as of today, make up 5.3% of the school-age population. If you look at the chart to the right, the data there reflects the declining percentages of African American students in public schools. Some counties have seen dramatic decreases in the African American population over the last 2 decades, as noted in the 2 bullet points there, beginning with the county of Alameda. The number has decreased, as well as San Francisco County. In the county of Alameda, between 1994 and 2018, they have experienced a decline in Black student population from 22.9% to 10%. And in San Francisco County, that decline has gone from 18.2% to 8.6%. As the population of African American residents and school-age students continue to dwindle, few comprehensive studies investigate the intersectional factors that have contributed to the shrinking size of Black communities in California. Though one study points to gentrification of California's urban centers, a subsequent housing crisis, and the quest for affordable living as products of systemic oppression impacting African American communities and thus influencing enrollment. Next slide. There are barriers and equity issues that African Americans face in public schools. And that those issues tend to impact students in tend to impact students at different levels. So some of those examples include the fact that African Americans are more likely to attend schools in economically disadvantaged or low-income racially segregated communities. They are more likely to experience barriers to attending early childhood and preschool education programs. They are also more likely to be chronically absent and be disciplined or suspended and expelled. The highest rates of chronic absenteeism in California, for example, are experienced by students who are African American. If you look at the figure 17 there, it shows what those rates are for African American students, as well as African American students with disabilities, where that number is slightly higher. Similarly, the rate for student suspension and expulsion is high for African American students, and that number is exacerbated for African American students with disabilities.
Disabilities.
Oh, thank you. Studies reveal that at every benchmark in Black students' lives, from early childhood education through higher education, they in fact encounter far more significant obstacles than their peers. Black students face racial discrimination in the form of implicit bias, microaggressions, or even subtle racial epithets aimed at their race that impact their social emotional well-being. And as we see with the data, they experience systemically lower expectations for achievement and excessive school discipline. Next slide. I want you to take a moment to think about the definition of equity, as Erica mentioned. Think about the definition that you've heard in the past and how the definition that you see here complements your district school or even your personal meaning and approach to working with African American students. Culturally relevant pedagogy is a known strategy to drive equity in schools. Culturally relevant pedagogy, or CRP, was coined by Gloria Lassing-Billings in her 1995 article entitled "Toward a Theory of Culturally Relevant Pedagogy." According to her work, culturally relevant pedagogy acknowledges and utilizes the cultural and historical backgrounds, knowledge, and experiences of students to inform teachers' classroom and methodology. CRP is useful in that it can help teachers to create a bridge between the identities and communities to which students belong, while simultaneously meeting learning objectives and expectations in the classroom. In order to implement CRP in schools, it really entails thinking about it from three different angles. First, at the district level, what that entails is that officials are able to address the socio-political consciousness in their definition of CRP, which is vital for effectively tackling the systemic roots of racism in American schools. This acknowledgement of the history that I spoke to earlier, as well as the persistent challenges that continue to impact students systemically. At the site level, administrators and staff are aware of the subconscious beliefs persistent within them, known as implicit bias. And lastly, at the classroom level, teachers are able to spend time cultivating relationships and making spaces where students can express their full humanity. The terminology and meaning of culturally relevant pedagogy has evolved over the past decade and is sometimes used synonymously with culturally responsive teaching and culturally sustaining pedagogy. Each of these frameworks offers a variation on the original concept of culturally relevant pedagogy. Again, this approach has proven effective in teacher education programs that should prepare teachers to successfully teach African American students and students of color. In another book, Lassing Billings wrote in 2001 that culturally relevant pedagogy is successful when students are able to experience academic success, develop and or maintain cultural competence, and develop a critical consciousness in which they challenge the status quo of the current order. Effective training is therefore required for new teachers to help students realize their goals. And promising implementation practices can occur across disciplines such as mathematics, STEM education, history, social science, English language arts. Next slide, please. The coronavirus and other recent events have put an enormous strain on our families of color and students nationwide. There is increasing evidence that African American students and other racial and ethnic minority groups are being disproportionately impacted by COVID-19. Many reports of COVID-19 have also highlighted age and sex-related differences in health outcomes. The graphic to the right is of an article that speaks specifically to what those differences are, and that was produced by CDC. This raises the question, how can educators and parents support children who may be struggling with anxiety, depression, trauma, fear, food security, or homelessness as a result of this crisis? Next slide. As it relates to African American students, it is important to consider what efforts were made prior to COVID-19 to address the needs of the students and their families. Attempts such as to solicit the voice of African American students and families, provide social emotional support, and provide access to technology will always be ongoing for African American students and for students of color. Now we must ask ourselves the question, similar to the Hurricane Katrina and other incidents that happened in our country, what does this mean in terms of long-term care that African American students need? So now the question becomes, how can schools further address trauma related to COVID-19 itself, as well as events related to racial injustice and equity issues as we have seen throughout 2020, in which African American students face in particular? With the Ways to Equity Playbook, we have created a series of resources and tools that you can utilize to address the different demographic groups. Briefly, to highlight a few for the African American student population, there is one that's here local in the Santa Clara County entitled the Black Leadership Kitchen Cabinet. And this focuses on African American students and African ancestry, a research project with tools and resources that address the racial identity and social emotional needs of students. Similarly, there are other studies and tools that focus specifically on trauma, such as the future of healing, shifting from trauma-informed care to healing-centered engagement, and affirming Black lives without inducing trauma. And that is to say, how to be strategic in working with students to discuss issues that they're facing, while also informing them on opportunities to leverage their experience and progress in their academic journey. There are also ways that educators, parents, and interested community members in this topic can take action. And there are a few studies that illustrate what action steps would take for different individuals, such as a report on Black Minds Matter, supporting the educational success of Black children in California, which points to students who actually fare well in the education system, as there are things that we can learn about what equity, successful equity means in looking at the outcomes and successful outcomes of African American students, just as looking at the equity issues that students face, and which I discussed earlier. Similar reports that focus more on suspension, and discipline are locked out of the classroom, how implicit bias contributes to disparities in school discipline, And Get Out, Black male suspensions in public schools. Lastly, if you're particularly interested in implementing culturally relevant pedagogy, first, reading the Ways to Equity Playbook will be useful. And in addition to that, there are other resources in which you could dwell deeper and think about what that means for your district. And those 3 examples are listed there. Thank you.
Hello. Hi. Just to refresh, I'm Anna Marie Villalobos, and I will be giving you an overview of the context for students with disabilities in the state of California, and going over several of the equity issues that are present for our students with disabilities. As we share the data, I would like you to think about the students who you work with. That humanization factor of the data is essential in doing equity work, because it's not just numbers, these are people that we're talking about. So I want you to always keep that in the back of your mind. I think it's really essential to make meaning out of what the data is, and to internalize the information as we go through this presentation. So let me start off by saying that there are several factors, including segregation, reduced rigor in instruction, deficit perspectives, and a shortage of qualified teachers that have led to inequities that students with disabilities have historically faced in their educational experience. The goal of IDEA is to provide a free and appropriate public education in the least restrictive environment for all students with disabilities. However, in analyzing the data for students with disabilities, this goal has yet to be reached. The exclusion of students with disabilities from the general education classroom often leads to a less rigorous curriculum, and oftentimes that less rigorous curriculum is in a separate classroom and in a more restrictive environment. So if we look at the data on this slide, you can see that students with disabilities perform far below their peers in both math and these are the CAS performance, the CAS scores, and in English language arts, and they perform at even a lower level in mathematics. Interesting, in a new study by Farkas, Morgan, Hilmer, Mitchell, and Woods, this is this year, 2020, an exceptional child, they did some examination of the differences between districts and where students were performing in terms of the opportunity gaps for between Black and white students, and also between Hispanic and white students. And they looked at districts that had a gap that was 0.4 standard deviations or higher. And they found that when the achievement gaps were large, students were more likely to be at risk for over-identification. Black and Hispanic students were as having a disability. However, when there was a smaller opportunity gap or a smaller achievement gap between Black, Hispanics, and white within a district, then white students were more likely to be overrepresented in terms of being identified for a disability. And there was a lower representation of Hispanic and Black students that were achieving at the same levels. So when we look at those findings, there's a lot of things that leap into my mind. We can start talking about implicit bias. We can start thinking about high expectations. When you think about those districts that may have a smaller gap, all of a sudden when they have their white students performing at the same level as Hispanic and Black students, oh, wow, that must be a disability. So that in itself for me is a very interesting idea. That in itself. And those with the larger gaps, instead of addressing perhaps, why do we have such huge gaps between our white students and our students of color? We are instead looking at, oh, that must be because they require special education. So I think some of the things that Angela brought up in her presentation, and Erica, in terms of taking a universalism approach, is the use of UDL, Universal Design for Learning in the classrooms, the use of culturally relevant pedagogy in the classrooms. These are the types of strategies that can make a difference in terms of raising the bar and raising the achievement for our students, looking at our implicit biases and thinking about what is it in terms of rigor that we are missing and that we don't have the expectations. I think about our our keynote speaker and how he specifically addressed this about expectations for him and how different people's different expectations made him react in certain ways. So those are all things that we really do need to keep in the back of our mind. On the next slide. This slide looks at outcomes for our students with disabilities within the state of California. This is really, for me, the humanization of the data. These are the outcomes. These are the long-term effects of the education that we are providing our students with disabilities. They graduate at a lower rate from high school. Fewer meet the UC and CSU requirements. Fewer earn a seal of biliteracy. Fewer of students with disabilities earn a Golden State Seal Merit Diploma. And the one thing that our students with disabilities unfortunately do at a higher rate is drop out of school. So when examining these different statistics, they really affect the long-term outcomes for our students because it hinders their ability to continue their higher education. It hinders their ability to obtain self-supporting work, and it hinders their ability to become independent, contributing members of society. So all of these factors, when you talk about that humanization piece, it's the long-term effect of our educational system and how our students with disabilities oftentimes are segregated or do not receive the instruction that they really do need to receive and do not necessarily have the expectations set there for them that have that long-term effect and impact. Next slide. So in looking at this, some of the students with disabilities, some of the key finding is that they're missing out on instruction, and they're missing out on that rigorous general education, a lot of times instruction, because that grade level instruction, because they have higher suspension rates. If you're suspended, you're not in class. So that is a real big issue for our students with disabilities. And Angela specifically addressed this for Black students with disabilities, but this is true for all of our students with disabilities, that they are suspended at a higher rate. And the other issue is that within the state of California, students with disabilities are more likely to be excluded from the general education classroom than their peers in other states. We have our students with disabilities in more restrictive environments in an SDC or a resource room at a higher rate pulled out of the general education classroom than the rest of the country does. So that's something that we as a state can really address and look at. What are the systems that we have in place? What does our instruction look like where this is something that is happening? So, and then this effect is further compounded with students with disabilities who are English language learners because they require specific instructional supports to acquire English language skills and then to address the general education curriculum. Next slide. So when we talk about students with disabilities, we also need to address the idea of intersectionality. The intersectionality is very important because when we look at how the three groups of students that are identified for the local control funding formula, we're looking at students, foster youth, we're looking at students with who are EL, and we're looking at students who are in a lower SES, socioeconomic status. And students with disabilities intersect across those three groups of students. So, for example, in the 2017-18 school year, 16.6% of EL students were identified as having a disability, as compared to the non-EL school population, which only had a rate of 12%. This means for our students who are EL, there is an over-identification with them. And a lot of times there are confusing factors with the identification of students who are acquiring a second language because the acquisition of a second language often mirrors what a student may have if they have a disability. So to address that, the California Department of Education has created a very useful practitioner's guide for educating English language learners with disabilities. Within that document, there's a link for it right here. It's also on their website, and I also have the resources later on. But within the practitioner's guide, it takes you step by step, starting with the referral process and helping folks to figure out, is this a disability or is this an English language issue that this student is currently have. This is just part of the natural process of acquiring English as a second language. Next slide. So students with disabilities and the impact of COVID-19. This is the issues that we talked about and addressed were further exacerbated, the inequities that occurred during the move to online learning this past year and currently, now within the states. Districts and schools, they really have struggled to redesign equitable instruction for all students. And earlier in their presentations, you heard about, access issues in terms of the internet, in terms of devices, so on and so forth. And all of those things are present too with our students with disabilities, because we talked about that intersectionality piece. But in addition to that, one of the most, there are additional struggles with implementing effective instructions for students with disabilities, particularly our students that have significant needs. It's been particularly difficult to design instruction for those students. So there have been numerous national organizations such as the Council on Exceptional Children, the Consortium of Citizens with Disabilities, and great schools that sent letters earlier in the year to the Department of Education requesting flexibility in terms of timelines for implementing IDA, because now it's been difficult and shifts had to be made to be online learning. But at the same time, making sure that IDEA is preserved for our students with disabilities. So the CDE has compiled resources and information on their website which address the implementation of IDEA during the COVID school shutdown. And here's a link for that. I shouldn't say shutdown, now the move to online learning that has happened most recently. And there's a link for that right there. Next slide. So on these next few pages, I'm going to be talking about some tools and some resources for working with students with disabilities. This first page mainly is dedicated with resources for teachers and districts. I'm working with students with disabilities during COVID-19 to support instruction during COVID-19 when we were doing our distance learning. So the first one is guidance issued by CDE on distance learning. And the next one provides research on how online learning can be made more accessible, engaging, and effective for students with disabilities. The next one, Common Sense Media, they're a great resource, and they have a curated list of best special education applications and websites and recommendations for teachers for working with students with disabilities, which can be accessed on their website. The Council for Exceptional Children also has developed COVID-19 information for special educators, including a forum for members on how to adapt IEP services during school closures, and that can also be accessed on this website. Next. The Council of Administrators of Special Education CASE, which is also out of CEC, has developed a resource page for special education administrators. And the State Educational Technology Directors Association, SETDA, offers strategies and resources for ensuring that online learning supports are present for students with disabilities. And then once again, here is the California Department of Education, that practitioner guide for students who are EL and also have a disability. And then also here's a link for CAST UDL, which is something that you should just have on your toolbar so that you can always click to that and go there for resources. Next. So on this slides, we have, in particular, we have Forward Together, which helping education, unlike the Power Students Who Learn Differently, which is a very useful resource. But two resources that I highly recommend are the University of Florida, their CEDAR resources and websites. And within that, and then on that website, they also have their high leverage practices, which recently came out of CEC, which are 22 high leverage practices that special education teachers and general education teachers can use in their classrooms that have a high impact and a high positive impact of learning for students with disabilities, and actually for all students. For example, explicit direct instruction, and it talks about scaffolds, and it has a lot of different information. It's a great website. There are videos that are available that explain a lot of the high leverage practices. Also is understood.org, which is a very well curated website that for parents, for teachers, for students, for administrators. It's a great website, has a lot of information in it, and can be very useful for parents in understanding teacher perspective, and for teachers for understanding parent perspectives, and for understanding student perspectives, because it addresses all three groups, and is a really like I said, well curated resource. Next. This last slide, Understood also has coronavirus resources that are available. And the IRIS Center from Vanderbilt University, and the IRIS is an incredible, I use that word a lot, is a good resource. Their website has modules, and you can input, you can search for certain like accommodations, modifications, you can put that in their search, and their the resource module will come up that specifically addresses that. The modules range from like 45 minutes to an hour and a half, but within the modules, they have a challenge, they have scenarios, they have videos discussing the different topics, they show you examples, they have different like little mini pop cruises. So they're individual little modules that really help you to dig deeper and get to know a topic. I found I do a lot of teacher education and administrator education courses, and I found that a lot of these modules are very helpful in terms for students in my classroom to have a deeper understanding of some of these different topics. And then the IRIS Center also has UDL, modules on UDL, and also now most recently modules on high leverage practices. So those are just a few resources that I hope can assist you in your work with students with disabilities, and keep on working, everyone. Keep on working hard. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Villalobos. So this is Erica Boas again. I'm going to be presenting on the context of English learners and some of the tools and resources that we think align well with serving equity for English learners. And I just want to note that this section was written by Dr. Villalobos, and I have the honor of presenting it today. So just to start, I want to ground us in the California context of students who are English learners. So about 19% of California enrollment in public schools are English learners, and almost 42% of those are enrollment of students who speak a language other than English in their homes. So 82% of English learners are Spanish speakers, and 70% of English learners are in grades K through 6. So we see here kind of what the lay of the land for English learners are. As I talk about the equity issues going forward and some of the resources and tools that align with English learners, please keep this context in mind. So some of the major equity issues surrounding for English learners really have to do with academic outcomes. So if we count graduation rates and college career readiness as academic outcomes, then we can really understand that English learners may not be facing some of the, disproportional suspension rates that, for example, African American students do, or students with disabilities. But we still see that academics are a significant equity issue for them. And we also will be looking at the California Assessment of Student Performance and Progress, or CAS scores going forward. Okay, so I'll begin with a statistical overview of the state of English learners for each of these categories, and then discuss some of the tools, practices, and resources for English learners. So here are the graduation rates for 2016-17 and 2017-18 across student groups. If we look at English learners, and I have that circled here, in comparison to white students, we see that there is about a 20 percentage point difference between the groups. So here are white students at the bottom with, for the 2 years, about 87% graduation rate. For English learners, that's a 20 percentage point difference at 67%. Um, with respect to the college career readiness outcome and meeting UC or CSU requirements, but we see that English learners are meeting those requirements at about 24% across the years 16, 17, and 17, 18, while white students, and I'm using this as a comparison group here for simplicity, are at about 55%. So that's a 30 percentage point difference for meeting UC and CSU requirements. And that means that they will not be eligible to go to a UC or CSU straight out of high school. And here with academic progress or the state test scores, we're going to be looking at the 2 years, 2017-18 and 2018-19, to see the comparison for students who are English learners. So with the CASP scores over the past several years, it's easy to see that English learners, for the most part, have not met standard, with almost 90% not meeting or nearly meeting standard over the past 2 years in both ELA and math. So that's almost 100% of English learners not meeting standard for these tests. So I present each of these charts to offer a snapshot of the state of academic outcomes for English learners as I talk about some of the equity issues, the tools and resources that are aligned with these equity issues going forward. And as Anna Marie and Angela spoke about, there's an importance of looking at intersectionality for English learners. And Anna Marie brought this up a bit, but a definition is when a student can be found in one or more identified student groups. So an intersectional data analysis matters because it allows us to drill down into disproportionality, where we must disaggregate data. So let's look at some of the examples here. In 2017 and 18, 12% of California students qualified for special education, but 16.6% of English learner students were identified as a student with disability. So they qualified for special education. So here we see that there's a disproportionality in students being identified, English learners being identified for disability. The second bullet point is that English learner students constitute over 20% of students who are socioeconomically disadvantaged. Okay, so we have to look at socioeconomic status and English language learners. And finally, suspension rates for English learners in 2017-18 was 3%, or 0.5% lower than overall. But for Latinx high school students who were English learners, it was 6.8%. And for Pacific Islander high school students who were English learners, it was 8.7%. So here, once again, we see a disproportionality in the suspension rates for English learners if we disaggregate the data and look intersectionally across the data. So I'm going to talk about a couple of examples of resources and tools and even models that help to address some of the equity issues for English learners. So one of the things we offer in the Ways to Equity playbooks that we haven't mentioned yet are a set of 4 case studies where we worked with partner districts to uplift their equity stories. One of these districts is the Mount Pleasant Elementary School District. So these are stories that are told toward the end of the playbook. And what they were able to do were engage in a focused practice of formative assessment for improving pedagogy for English learners that was carried out through a cohort model of shared teacher leadership. So remember, we talked about the systems needing to change. This is one of the systems that they worked to improve. They tested their new program and process using an improvement science methodology. So I don't have time to go into the fantastic specifics of their process, but that's written up in our Ways to Equity playbook. But I want to shine a line on their emphasis on changing systems by basing their model in transparency, trust, and collaboration, with an emphasis on developing teacher leadership. So we talked about flattening that leadership hierarchy. This is an example. And this strategy was grounded in a safe to fail, learning by doing approach. A couple of other equity practice highlights that I want to talk about here for English learners are about creating inclusive practices in the school. So the first is greetings at the door, where a teacher greets students at the door every day just to check in, and the My Name, My Identity initiative that has been a foundational practice coming out at the Santa Clara County Office of Education. While these practices seem simple enough, for English learners, they may do an incredible amount by fostering a sense of inclusion and belonging that students who are immigrants may especially benefit from. And you'll find links to resources here in the handout that we provided of our presentation that describe these practices in more detail. And just as Dr. Birts and Villalobos have explained, with the demands of remote learning during COVID-19, it's imperative that we turn up a heightened sensitivity to the experiences of English learners. So it has been found that within the homes of English learners, they may have limited access to the technology needed for their instruction. In addition, their caring adults may not be able to provide the foundational academic support needed. So let's stay attuned to that and provide extra attention to the English learners. And here, I won't go into all of these in great detail, but I want to, again, suggest that you go to our presentation that's linked as an attachment to our portal. And these are all clickable tools and resources that are also found in our Ways to Equity playbook. So we have Colorín Colorado, distance learning for ELs. And this is especially important given what I just talked about with respect to remote learning. The California one has a course with a micro-credential badge called Supporting English Learners. The California Department of Education provides a Learning Foundations website for English learners. And as Dr. Villalobos mentioned, the CDE also has a fantastic and thorough practitioner's guide for educating English learners with disabilities. And finally, there's the California English Learner Roadmap, which again is a robust resources with plenty of tools for supporting English learners. So I will, in review, just go over a few key points here, and then I will open it up for a few minutes of questions that you may have. So first is that the Ways to Equity playbook was developed to facilitate a systems change approach to working toward equity that is versatile and differentiated, while offering many, many tools for you to use, as you have seen. Targeted universalism guides practices that focus on the most vulnerable student groups while maintaining support for all students, African American students, students with disabilities, and English learners. And finally, and most importantly, there's no better time than now. Now when you have all these challenges to deal with, to start, continue, and dive deeply into your equity work, because these students and these families really, really matter in the work that we are doing right now. So with respect to next steps, please complete the post-conference feedback survey and you'll receive a link to the free electronic Ways to Equity playbook. We have this, it is in hard copy form, but the way it's most useful is actually in the electronic free version. And for more information, you can contact Kathy Wall, who's the director of the Inclusion Collaborative. And here is the information for the presenters once again. So thank you everybody for your time, and we hope to be able to field questions, and I'm going to leave that to our coordinators to help us do. We have 5 minutes.
I don't have the figures off the top of my head, but I did a study last year and I specifically pulled that out, but I pulled it out only for Santa Clara County. But there is, once again, intersectionality. Erica's looking, it looks like Erica's looking it up. There is definite intersectionality between the two groups. And off the top of my head, I don't know. But once again, that is one of the intersectionality groups.
The other thing is that you can email us at our emails and ask that question, because we do have it. It's just that it's hard to pull up those data in the minutes that we have. So whoever posed that question, thank you. And email probably Dr. Villalobos, who would be the one closest to that information. Thanks for putting the screen back. Okay, well then maybe we do have time to look up that answer. So we think that the playbook is very usable. It is pretty thorough and robust, so there's quite a bit of reading. And one of the things I should also say, since we have time while Dr. Villalobos looks this up, is that we designed it knowing that people would not read all 80 pages necessarily, although we hope that people do. It's pretty good reading. But we really want you to read the introduction and the how to use the playbook, as well as the pieces on the student groups, because we go into some pretty finite detail on why equity is important for these student groups. But the rest of it, so we have, social emotional learning as one of our areas. Like I mentioned, we have the state indicators, we have culturally relevant pedagogy, we have creating a culture of inclusion and belonging as one of the sections. So we try to be as thorough as possible. The other part of it is that each section has reflection questions for you and your teams or your district or your schools to be able to reflect personally, but also institutionally on where you might be on your equity journey. I've not even launched the playbook yet. So you are actually the first group who is really getting this presentation. We finished the playbook about a month and a half ago, and we've been in sort of launch mode and preparation mode. So our hope is that we can partner with districts or schools who pick up the playbook and start to use it to learn how it's being used, but also to learn how we can improve it. So yeah, fill out that survey so you can get access to your copy. And you'll be really the first.
Okay, so for Santa Clara County, there are about 28, this was from last year or from 2 years ago. So there were about 28,400 students that had a disability. And of those 28,409 students, 14,604 were also socioeconomically disadvantaged. 416 were also homeless. 10,533 were English language learners. And so out of that 28,409, 25,754 were in one of the three categories for LCFF. And about 201 were also foster youth. So it tells you, if you're a student with a disability, the intersectionality is huge. The chances are you're going to be in one of the other three groups. And it really highlights how vulnerable this group of students really are across a variety of criteria areas. Okay. So that's just Santa Clara County, though.
Yes. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
See ya. Thank you.
Bye.